Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session, Defending Our Water Rights, How Environmental Lawyers Are Helping to Save the Planet. My name is Michaela Eskelson, and I'm the Senior Manager of Foundation Relations at Equal Justice Works. We are so grateful you all are able to join us today to hear from our fantastic panel. If you'd like to enable closed captioning on your screen, please click the closed captioning option at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions or comments for our panelists during the session, please type them into the Pathable chat box. Our panelists will answer questions toward the end of the session. The session will run from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have to leave during part of the session, you can always rejoin by clicking on the name of this session under the Event Agenda section. This session will be recorded, so if you are unable to rejoin, you will be able to listen to it at a later date. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Nicholas Schreck, Associate Dean of Experiential Education and Associate Professor of Law at University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. Thanks, Nicholas.
Great, thanks, Michaela. And wonderful to be with you all. Thank you for joining. And this panel, so you make sure you're in the right place, is Defending Our Water Rights, How Environmental Lawyers Are Helping to Save the Planet. And this is a great kind of panel because I just get to shut up and listen to three really amazing, incredible lawyers who are really at the forefront of environmental justice issues related to water and are doing incredible work in all of their respective positions. And so the way the format of the panel will go is I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves and give a brief opening statement, and then we'll get into some prepared questions. But I would encourage you attendees to post your questions in the Pathable chat, and we'll monitor that and make sure we can answer as many questions as possible by the end of the hour. So without further ado, I'm just going to, maybe we'll go in an order to make this, so this will be our first test to see if we can do this. So I'll have Seema go first, then Aaron, and then Camille. Okay, so I'll kick it over now to Seema to introduce yourself, please. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick. It's lovely to have so many attendees here today. I am Seema Kakade. I am a professor at the University of Maryland School of Law, and I am the director of our environmental law clinic. So we have students that work on real environmental legal matters for free. For community groups. That's what we do, and it's terrific. And we work in the water space quite a bit. And before I came to the faculty at University of Maryland School of Law, I spent a lot of time at the federal government, both the U.S. Department of Energy and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where I worked on a variety of issues that all also link back to water in various ways. And so I'm happy to talk further about this terrific area of practice, legal practice, and policy work in the water space. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Seema. Now I'll kick it over to Aaron, please.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here today. My name is Erin Meddy. I'm a staff attorney at the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center here in Detroit, Michigan. GLELC is a nonprofit organization that offers community education, policy support, and a whole variety of legal services to address environmental, resource, and energy issues that are affecting communities in and around Detroit, all over Michigan, and really throughout the Great Lakes region with a particular focus on environmental justice. And we mainly work with other nonprofit organizations and informal community groups and local government. And I started in this role as staff attorney last fall following a 2-year Equal Justice Works fellowship, also at GLELC. And my current work is really a continuation of my fellowship project, which focused on protecting children in Detroit and Flint and throughout Southeast Michigan from home-based environmental health hazards like lead paint, lead contaminated drinking water, and lack of access to drinking water due to unaffordable water bills and water shutoffs. And I do this by providing legal counseling and representation to affected families, as well as advocating for policy that addresses the root causes of this really unique environmental justice issue. So yeah, I'll kick it back to Nick.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And Camille, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Camille Penu. I'm a visiting assistant clinical professor and co-director of the Community and Economic Development Clinic at UC Irvine School of Law. But I started my career as an Equal Justice Works Fellow in California, San Joaquin Valley, where I was an Environmental Justice and Community Economic Development Fellow. So I do transactional law and policy advocacy in support of environmental justice, which is a little bit of a emergent field. And the majority of my work was not focused on water during my fellowship, although I represented 2 communities who didn't have access to safe drinking water. And I went on to found UC Davis's Water Justice Clinic, which was the first clinic of its kind in the country to address implementing California's human right to water. And so a lot of the work we did was representing small community organizations who were trying to get access to safe drinking water because their drinking water supply was contaminated or because they just didn't have access to piped water in a sustainable way. And I continue to do that work, although not in my official capacity today, as a member of the state's advisory committee on the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, which was part of a suite of policy packages that were passed to help address water justice in California.
Excellent, thanks, Camille. And maybe I'll stick with you and throw the first question your way. So you've already highlighted a couple of things related to water, but I was wondering if you could maybe just give us a little bit more in depth about a project related to water quality or water access that you've been involved in, and just kind of share some more details with the group. Thank you.
Sure. So California has this is true actually throughout the country, has a long history of racial exclusion in the provision of drinking water, and particularly around how cities and agricultural areas defined their borders. So they used to purposely exclude low-income communities of color, I think, to dilute their voting rights, but allegedly because they were poor and they didn't want to pay for their infrastructure. Query how they got that way, but usually it was through intentional policies of redlining, explicit policies of racial exclusion, discrimination in the housing market. And so those communities still exist today. These issues are over 70 years old. And a lot of how California has been trying to deal with it has been through encouraging the merger of water systems, which sounds very technical and boring, but I promise you is like a very community-driven process because it requires California has a lot of procedural requirements for how you engage communities. And so several of the projects I've worked on have been things like helping communities form their own water cooperative so that they can then access state funding to address water quality. Most of the folks I work with have either arsenic or nitrate contamination. Some have uranium as well. These are all super expensive things to try to treat and are extremely dangerous to your health in the short and the long term. And the other major group of cases that I tended to work on were these cases of these small communities on the border of a city trying to annex in or merge their water system with city water so that they could get a more sustainable water source. And so it was really fun. Transactional work can be incredibly rich and really rewarding. It can be really challenging. And so it's interesting to try to navigate what does it mean to be a community lawyer who's also, a transactional lawyer when transactional law tends to be associated with business law. But in this context, it's all like contracts about how folks are going to merge, how they're not going to merge, agreements with the state. California has like a very lengthy process on land use, especially on the reorganization of government to provide land uses and essential services. And so we did a lot of work on that. And I know that's not a specific case, but I feel like it's helpful to talk about kind of the trends. And then the other area where I do a lot of work is policy advocacy around legislation, and analyzing legislation for advocates and for lawmakers to help them understand whether a bill will actually achieve the goals that they want in increasing access to water. So a lot of that has been around creating this funding source in the state that is specifically dedicated to low-income communities who don't have access to safe drinking water, and how to fund their infrastructure improvements, particularly in communities where it's not possible to merge and where they're always going to be so small that they're underwater. They like operate at a deficit every single year. And so how do we achieve affordability when you know that you have a financially unsustainable system? And so a lot of the work I've done has been consulting on that or on administrative programs. All with
Excellent.
Students, because I'm a clinical professor. So students are doing all this work. I'm just the link that helps build the relationships.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Great, great examples. And now, Aaron, we'll go to you next. Highlight some water work or projects that you've engaged in, please.
Sure. Yeah. So as I said in my intro, we do a lot of work with drinking water quality, particularly around lead contamination issues, which is pretty well known in Michigan, especially following the Flint water crisis. And we're currently seeing another water crisis similar to Flint unfolding in Benton Harbor, Michigan, which is a small town in Southwest, kind of on the shore of Lake Michigan. So in early September of this year, we at GLELC, in partnership with about 20 other local and national environmental and advocacy organizations, filed a petition for emergency action under the Clean Water Act with the EPA, trying to get them to intervene in Benton Harbor and to abate the lead contamination in the drinking water there. So residents have been, since at least 2018 and possibly, most likely long before that, residents have been subjected to high levels of lead contamination in their drinking water. And local community leaders have been ringing the alarm on this, in particular, Reverend Pinckney, who's been an advocate for residents for a long time. So they've been ringing this alarm for years and trying to provide bottled water to residents, and reached out to us and some other organizations for legal assistance. So this petition was really driven by their organizing and advocacy, and we tried to identify some of the legal tools in our toolbox that we could use to support that work. And we identified this emergency petition as one avenue. So despite there being really clear requirements in the federal and Michigan lead and copper rule, Michigan has one of the strongest the strongest lead and copper rule in the country following the Flint water crisis. There's these clear requirements for actions that the Benton Harbor Public Water System and the state environmental agency called the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy are supposed to take when there's a lead action level exceedance. And obviously there was this precedent set by Flint, but both the local and state governments really failed to act in accordance with that law. So we alerted the state more than a year ago that we thought they were in violation of the lead and copper rule, and that this was a really urgent issue, and just really didn't get much of a response. So as a result, residents continued to live, even today, with significant and dangerous levels of lead contamination, years after the contamination was first discovered. And so we petitioned the EPA and urged them to take action. And since then, the state has stepped up somewhat, finally admitting that the water is not safe to drink, and providing bottled water to residents and prepared formula for infants, which has been really significant because infants and young children are especially vulnerable to the impacts of lead contamination. And we've been still in communication with the EPA. They haven't issued a formal response to our petition yet. They're just sort of waiting to see how the state responds, I think. And so yeah, this particular petition really grew out of our work with local community organizations. That's sort of what drives our work. We try to practice community lawyering, which we envision as connecting with and listening to impacted communities and frontline organizations, and working collaboratively with them to come up with solutions to the environmental justice issues that they see. And this just happens to be a really significant environmental injustice that's recently come up here in Michigan.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And I would encourage any of the students just Google Benton Harbor lead, and you'll see a bunch of stories, and then you can link to that petition, which was really a great piece of work from Great Lakes Environmental Law Center and their partners. So please do check that out. I think that's actually a great segue, talking about community lawyering and working with organizers. To now, I'll kick it over to Seema and ask you the same question about a water project you've engaged in.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. Thanks for the question. So I want to just for a second zoom out and talk to attendees a little bit about what we mean when we say water. I think water, it feels like it's this narrow area, but it's actually hugely wide. I mean, we're talking even in this conversation about drinking water, which is really different, right, than something like groundwater. which is really different than, say, wetlands, which is really different than, say, coastal ecosystems or floodplains, right? And there are justice issues that are pervasive in all those different kinds of water systems. And so I just want attendees to realize that water is not at all one thing. It's multiple different things. And as a result, it makes the legal and regulatory and policy world incredibly complex. I mean, we have multiple different federal environmental statutes that govern different kinds of water. So it's not like we have everything under the Clean Water Act. For example, we've got things under the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is very different. A different statute, different regulatory structure, different agencies involved. And so I just want people to realize that water is this really complex and vastly, different sources and different kinds of impacts, depending on what kind of water you're talking about. And so even in the area of, say, recreational waters, which my clinic works on quite a bit because we are near a coastal ecosystem. And so we are near a very large watershed called the Chesapeake Bay. We are also very near many, many rivers that feed in to the Chesapeake Bay and then feed in to the ocean as a result. And so there are waters that are being used for recreational purposes and for jobs. Right? There's a lot of communities that very much rely on water for a living, right? They're farmers, they're fishermen. And so there's whole communities of people and justice-oriented communities at that, that are very concerned about wetlands, about coastal ecosystems, about flooding, which is a major problem in the East Coast, particularly as we're thinking about climate justice issues. And so we deal with a lot of flooding problems in Maryland and in the Mid-Atlantic. And so, we've worked on a whole variety of issues in my clinic related to different aspects of water. So I'll highlight just a couple. And this gives you the complexity, right? We had a case for a long time that was actually on coal ash, okay? And what's coal ash? It's a byproduct of coal-fired power plants. So people might be thinking, right, oh, this is about air pollution because we're talking coal-fired power plants, right? But what's interesting about a thing like a coal-fired power plant, it produces all kinds of pollution. Yes, it produces air pollution, but it also produces a waste byproduct called coal ash that needs to go somewhere. And where does it go? Into the ground, into a landfill. And where does it go from there? Often into our water systems that are underground that can impact drinking water wells, but also groundwater. Right. And so that means that something like coal ash, when it infiltrates into the ground, it can affect multiple different kinds of water. And you might need to use multiple different advocacy routes, right, under multiple different kinds of water laws and non-water laws to actually get to the water pollution problem that's present for the communities that live near and around that coal ash facility. So my clinic has worked on a variety of legal avenues to address coal ash pollution that is affecting water systems. We've looked at zoning, which doesn't even focus on the Clean Water Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act, but is actually focused on the operation of that landfill at all in an area that has high number of residences, right? Then we look at zoning as a legal tool, right? So there's multiple different ways, is my point, that my clinic tries to use, and advocacy ways to get at water, because it's not always clear and it's not always straightforward. So that's one example, is in the space of coal ash, that I just wanted to highlight to reflect that broader sense of water.
Yeah, that's great, and really, really helpful discussion of the kind of interplay between these laws, and sometimes the kind of questioning where the overlap is, or are we missing some sort of regulatory tool? And that's I think a really interesting space to be working in, and very glad to hear that you're on it. And maybe I'll keep you on the hot seat for a second, Seema, and ask, you touched on this a little bit, maybe related to flooding, but I don't want to pre-answer the question for you. But how does climate change? How is that impacting your work related to water, or how do you anticipate it will impact your work going forward?
Yeah, so I'm going to stay on the land use and zoning track, which my clinic does a lot in that space, in the land use zoning area. And we're really seeing, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic area, a lot of development. I mean, we're just a really pretty crowded area with a lot of people. And when I mean by development, I mean housing development, I mean infrastructure development, like pipelines and roads and rail and, ports, expansion of ports, because we're coastal and we got a lot of ships coming in and out. So we just have a lot going on here in terms of development. And what does that mean? Usually when you're developing something, it means you're taking something else that was there before out. All right. And so what we're seeing is a lot of communities that are concerned, particularly about development replacing wetlands, floodplain areas, natural sort of ecosystems that have been historically helpful with, right, major hurricanes and major flooding that has come in, right? And so in addition to increased susceptibility to major storm events that is happening up and down the East Coast, we are also developing rapidly and replacing that existing natural infrastructure that really does help on flooding. And so we're really trying to tackle it more from a land use and zoning perspective, because that's what we're seeing as an example of sort of the problem with respect to flooding, right? The other area that we're seeing and doing work in, Nick, is with respect to really focused on issues that are involving industrial wastewater and stormwater. So we're seeing a huge increase, obviously, in the amount of storms. And what does that mean? There's a lot of runoff. And when you get runoff, okay, all of that runoff water is, right, collecting everything that's in its way. That can be oil, that can be chemicals, and we've got a lot of manufacturing facilities that have a lot of chemicals, and we've got roads with a lot of trucks right up and down the East Coast. And so all of that junk, if you will, right, is being washed out when we've got a massive rain event, which is happening more frequently. And so there's lots of ways that increased storms and flooding are impacting the Mid-Atlantic region and the East Coast generally. And I just don't see that work really going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I think you're right. Some of these changes are certainly already baked in, regardless of what we're able to do with cutting emissions and all that. So yeah, very important work. Thanks, Seema. And now I will go to Camille, please. So same question, climate change, how is that impacting your work, or how do you see it impacting your work going forward?
Sure. So California is in a little bit of a weird position with climate change because the West is very dry, unlike the East. So the East has lots of water and water quality issues tend to dominate. The West has very little water, and so we fight over it all the time. And so climate change has certainly increased the severity and prevalence of drought and wildfire. Wildfires have like a profound effect on the permanent like surface water ecosystem. And so we've had a significant decline in surface water, not related to direct climate change temperature increase, but related to wildfires scorching the earth and like affecting how water is retained in soil and how that affects supply overall. And then, of course, we have a large coast that is highly developed, and we have been dealing with storm surge issues and concerns around sea level rise around there. With respect to the coast, I tend not to work there, although the environmental law clinic at UC Irvine does. And that's because we have all sorts of coastal communities that are not high income, surprisingly, I guess, for most people's vision of California. And they're in areas that are certainly going to flood. So there's a lot of conversation right now happening around the concept of managed retreat, where most of my work sounds is in our drought resiliency planning. So the state is undergoing like this massive revisioning of how it's going to be dealing with the fact that climate change is real. And we've been pretty aggressive on climate emissions, although I think we have a ways to go. And we've also, like about 10 years ago, began the process of connecting climate emissions to land use decision making so that folks could understand that those are very related. But now we're undergoing the process of dealing with water, and it will be interesting to see how it shakes out, because historically the way that we've dealt with it is we just pump everything out of the ground. We have most of our water specifically for drinking water, but all water use really is stored underground or in the snowpack. So we don't have much of a snowpack anymore because we're in the state of like perma drought. And our groundwater is just now getting regulated because people have been overdrawing from it for a really long time. So a lot of the advocacy is in making sure local community voices are heard. Usually the kind of framework in the West of how fights happen over water is it's the environment, which is people who want water to flow naturally. I don't understand how this is like considered a diversion in some way. It's just the most bizarre thing. But people who are like, oh yeah, rivers should flow. Shocking statement. And we should be mindful of the fisheries, for example, that Native communities rely on and have a reserved right to have sustenance in and other kind of cultural practice in. Then you have a group that's like water should be diverted for agricultural purposes primarily, and ag is by far the biggest water user in California. And then you have people who say, well, we need it for drinking water also. And urban users are the smallest part of the pie. And what's completely lost in that conversation is rural water users in particular, and small water systems who rely really heavily on this. And so they have not historically been at the table in drought resilience planning. And a lot of the work that I do is with community organizations that build up community voices so they have a seat at the table when the state is doing regional and state planning around drought and is accepting public comments around drought. Because historically it's been people fighting over whether they're going to get an allocation from this very large water project that's been built. And that doesn't include in any way all of these communities that lose their groundwater and lose their only source of water supply every time we have a drought because agriculture overdraws and others overdraw from the system. So that's where climate change is hitting water, land use, and water planning and decision making. But there's such like Seema said, there's such a rich, diverse area of law practice. Like I've practiced very little water law, is what I would say. Like just straight water rights law, which I think is what most people think of when they think of water people. I don't practice in the Clean Water Act. I'm aware of it. I deal with it, but not often, and not in the Safe Drinking Water Act either. Almost everything I do ends up being in local government law and state law. And I want to just make a plug that most environmental practice happens, most law practice happens at the state and local level. So, for folks who are interested in a really kick-ass like career, think really critically about the opportunities you might have in local government in particular, but also in groups that work with local government, whether that's community organizations like legal aid societies and other kinds of community-based advocacy groups, or whether that's small boutique law firms that serve local government in particular. There's just a lot of opportunity there. And of course, there's like, the state government, the federal government, et cetera. But there's a lot happening in environment that I think has a lot of pathways for everyone. You don't have to be like a super techie clean water person or Safe Drinking Water Act person. Like Seema said, there's like such a wide variety. You could go into any part of it and have a lot of opportunity.
Excellent, thank you. And a really great kind of compare and contrast with East Coast coastal issues. And now we'll go to another part of the country. Erin, so same question, climate change, how's that impacting your work?
Yeah, similar to the East Coast here in the Midwest, I think the biggest impact of climate change on our work is definitely in flooding and increased and more intense rain events. This summer in particular, Detroit was hit really hard with flooding. And it's an old city. The stormwater and sewage systems really aren't equipped to handle those increased rain and flooding events. So that's having a direct impact on the clients that we serve. And we're seeing that issues of drinking water quality and access are compounded by these flooding events. So just one example, I was assisting a client trying to get their water restored. Their water service had been shut off for failure to pay their water bill. But because of a basement flooding event several years ago, this person lost their furnace and hot water heater, and then they were left without heat through the winter. Which is pretty brutal here in Michigan, and that caused their pipes to freeze and burst. So then those leaks drove up their water bill to the point where they couldn't pay at all, and all while they couldn't actually use their water because the plumbing was no longer functional. And so that was just one example of sort of these cascading and compounding effects of climate change on infrastructure failure, and then that gets pushed off as this individual burden and lack of access to drinking water. And it's just it's a really sort of frustrating irony. We live in the Great Lakes state where we're literally surrounded by the largest freshwater source in the world. And but then we're dealing with being literally inundated by water from rain and flooding, but this actually makes it harder to ensure access to safe and affordable drinking water. So for our organization, we're likely to see a lot more clients like that, clients that are dealing with the very direct impacts of flooding on their homes and in their local, in their neighborhoods and local communities. So I see a lot of our work. We'll be focusing in on building climate resiliency into local law and policy. That'll be a bigger part of our work. As Camille said, a lot of our work is dealing with the state environmental agency, local government, city council. And so we'll be pushing more climate resiliency through policy advocacy and providing more legal assistance to more individual clients dealing with these issues in the future. I think those will be that's where we'll see these impacts of climate change most directly in our work.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, and it's been pretty dramatic over the last couple of years to see to live through it personally, but to also experience the, cars being completely flooded on the highway, whether it's on the East Coast from tropical storms or hurricanes, or in the Great Lakes region here from just really intense rainstorms. It really is dramatic. And I can't help myself, and I'll just say that those of you listening, if you're interested in infrastructure issues related to water, call up your senator and let them know that that's something you care about. You'd like to see some investments in things like, green infrastructure, dealing with stormwater and replacing lead pipes, all that kind of stuff. So, okay, we have a question in the chat, so I'll make this one for volunteers. So, and actually, Camille, you touched on this a little bit, but so the question is related to Native and Indigenous people, and how they're often at the forefront of water movements and the fights for water justice. And I'd love to hear if any of you have thoughts on how either working with Native communities and kind of helping scale up their legal efforts, or maybe some tools that we can use related to Native and Indigenous communities in water related work. So if anyone would like to take that one.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have not had the opportunity to do as much work as I would like with Indigenous communities. I come to this work very much from an environmental justice perspective, and the environmental justice movement has always had, like, the Indigenous people's movement and rights movement has always informed environmental justice. They've always been a critical partner at the table and thought leaders in the space. But geography really affects kind of where there's opportunity for linkages. And what I've learned mostly by screwing up is that it's also a very different framework. And so, like, I come from an environmental justice community that's it was majority Black, it's now majority Latinx and Asian. And so I had like a very strong race and civil rights lens. And what I didn't realize was how important the language matters when you partner in with Indigenous communities. So there's much more of a focus on sovereignty and on the autonomous rights of those nations. And for example, I learned that stakeholder is not a good word to use when you're talking to tribes, because they're not stakeholders, they're leaders and sovereigns with distinct rights from other community groups who may also have water injustices that they're facing. And so for me, it's been a lot of trying to intentionally partner with people and with organizations that work with Native communities in order to build trust relationships over time. I think there are other geographies where that would be necessary to do faster and sooner. I will say one of the kind of projects I've been trying to look at with other researchers at the moment is trying to track how water rights were stolen from Indigenous communities. California had a very aggressive policy of essentially displacing people, stealing their land, completely displacing them, and then transferring their water rights to PG&E to create a hydroelectric dam while also flooding their ancestral homeland. And so there's some really interesting work to be done there, because California is such a young state, comparatively speaking, in tracking who had their water rights stolen, and then thinking about the state, for example, has every year, if you don't use your water right, it's a use it or lose it system. You don't own water, you own the right to use water. And so we have what's called the forfeiture pool. And usually who applies to the forfeiture pool are very highly organized contractors, i.e. irrigation districts, who are trying to get water out of that pool. And so one of the things we've been trying to do is figure out how to work with tribes to map whose water rights were lost through these interviews and through other archival work, and then to figure out if we can get them to get first right of access to the forfeiture pool, for example, to have rights transferred back. So there's projects like that that I think can happen everywhere. I mean, I think the most obvious project that was like very visibly water or tribal led was like around the Dakota Access Pipeline. And one of the most, I think, depressing things is to read the NEPA litigation that happened in that, and like the ways in which they didn't get an injunction, for example. And it wasn't until there were like pipeline spills and leaks happening in another pipeline that they'd opposed and lost the fight over that the court began to actually consider that an injunction might be proper. This is all to say that I think there's a critical need for work there, and there's certainly organizations that do it. And I think if you're excited and interested in it, like, be very intentional, come in very humble, listen to the work that folks have done, and think about how you can add to their work or help build their foundation of empowerment with them, instead of trying to come in as like a technical solution solver, I guess, on the side, which is often the way that lawyers are trained. Even community lawyers are often trained to come in that way. So that would be my best advice.
Great, thank you. Seema or Aaron, want to take a shot at that one?
In with, sort of echo, I think, a lot of what Camille is saying about Indigenous populations. Really, I have worked mostly with Indigenous populations actually in international settings. So, and I think it's quite similar to what Camille is talking about, is that we've got Indigenous populations in multiple different parts of the world that very much believe in self-determination, believe in sovereignty, believe in really an ability to control the land and the natural resources that they are directly related to. And they very much feel that it is a relationship. And so I do think that it is a completely different calculus. And there is a lot of historical, just like with other justice-oriented, particularly racial justice-oriented communities, there is a historical context for each of those communities that is pretty distinct from each other. And I think it is really important to recognize that, that justice communities are not all the same, and we do have significant differences. And I do think that there are really interesting laws just to be aware of that are very important, that really do mandate agency, for example, consultation in a variety of contexts that are related to this concept of sovereignty and self-determination in Native American space. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about water being a really broad topic, right? Even when we're talking about water with respect to Indigenous communities, we actually are also talking, like Camille was discussing, about pipelines and pollution. We are also talking about, honestly, historic preservation, which we have a whole separate statute for historic preservation, which is really, really important and is all connected to land and connected to natural resources and connected to spirituality and connected to lots of different things that water is a part of, right? Just indirectly. And it really depends on how we're thinking about water and how it relates to the ecosystem and the cultural systems that exist around it.
Could I say one more thing just really quickly? It occurred to me, one of the things that was really helpful for me as an advocate was to begin reading about water colonialism, just because there's a fundamental difference in how our Anglo-American system thinks about water and how other communities think about water, including Indigenous communities. And as Seema said, there's not one Indigenous way of thinking about water, but if this is an area of advocacy, I really encourage you to read about water colonialism and how our assumptions around our legal system also affect our advocacy.
Thanks, Camille. Aaron?
Yeah, here, just echoing what's already been said, when we think of ourselves as an environmental justice organization here at GLELC, and often the environmental justice issues facing communities here in Detroit does look quite different than the issues facing Native communities in, for instance, Northern Michigan and the Upper Peninsula. And we've tried to partner with statewide coalitions to sort of amplify the issues, and also amplify the idea that, yes, these issues may look different and affect different communities, but issues related to water justice are interconnected here in the state. And we've tried to amplify the leadership of Native communities that have been in particular, fighting to shut down Line 5 through the Straits of Mackinac, which is a threat to drinking water source for everyone in Michigan. And we've also seen leadership on the issue of water privatization here in the state. There's a lot of pressure coming from corporations like Nestle, who want to increase pumping of groundwater, and Native communities have really led the fight against those efforts. It's certainly an area that I would like to see more investment in from our organization, something we're going to continue to work on in the future. But I think recognizing that water issues are all interconnected here in the state and affect all of the environmental justice communities here in Michigan.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, and for those that haven't heard that before, so Line 5 is actually, it's an oil pipeline that runs along the bottomlands of the Great Lakes between where the Lake Michigan and Lake Huron connect. So Straits of Mackinac. So it's a risk. It's been hit by anchors a couple times. It's kind of a ticking time bomb that keeps some of us up at night. So thanks, Erin. And actually, can I stick with you, Erin? So another question in the chat asked about whether there's a difference between environmental justice and conservation. And so maybe it might be helpful to define some of those terms, from all of you. I'd love to hear your perspective on what do you mean by environmental justice and what do you mean by conservation?
Sure. Yeah, environmental justice to us, means having sharing the burdens of environmental harm across communities, preventing that concentration in particular communities, low-income communities and communities of color, as well as ensuring that everyone has equal participation in the decision-making process that affects these environmental issues and are meant to address these environmental harms. I think it's been an interesting development working in the public interest environmental law world, particularly in a nonprofit in a majority Black city like Detroit. I think that up until recently, most environmental law organizations have focused on conservation, and I think of conservation as sort of the traditional world of environmental law that's protecting water resources from point source pollution and dealing with land conservation and those sorts of issues. And there's been a real shift towards a focus on environmental justice. And I think of that as sort of reconceptualizing the impacts of environmental harm on public health in particular, and not just environmental harms harming the environment, but at how it affects people and particularly their health. I do think those issues and those areas of law are certainly interconnected, particularly when we're talking about issues of drinking water quality. Drinking water quality. But I'm really encouraged by this shift in focus to having a more people-centered approach to environmental law.
Great, thanks. And Seema or Camille, would you like to jump in on this one as well? Yeah, Seema.
Sure. So I really think that environmental justice is very distinct from environmental. I think we often lump green organizations of any kind into one category. These are all environmental nonprofits. They're all doing similar kind of work, I think, is the assumption from government agencies. I think it's the assumption from corporate entities. I think it's often the assumption in the public at large. I think it's sometimes the assumption in academic communities. But I actually think that there's quite a bit of difference within the group of environmental nonprofit organizations. And I do think that they sometimes conflict in what their priorities are. I'll give you a very sort of classic example that we see in the East Coast related to public rail. Public rail is, certainly environmentalist dream, right? Who doesn't want to get people out of their cars into public transportation, right? Like public transportation is one of those things that's a climate solution. And we want less cars on the road, and all of that seems good from a quote environmental standpoint. But when you start really thinking about the communities that are impacted by rail most directly, right? Often what we see, particularly on the East Coast, is that constructing, right, rail stations takes forever, right? And the amount of traffic that builds up around rail stations takes forever. And often the train ride and the cost of that train ride is way too expensive for the communities that live around the station to ever actually benefit from, right? And sometimes you have situations where it's not even the station, it's the rail line. And so people's homes, if they own them, won't even go up in value because they actually are not near the rail station for commuters. They're actually just near the crappy rail yard, right? Or the rail lines. And so when you start to dig into the actual implementation of public rail and who it's impacting, right? And who it's impacting in negative ways, suddenly you have a justice issue. Suddenly you have a community issue. Suddenly you have a people issue that is very separate and apart from the laudable environmental or climate-oriented goals that something like public rail might bring. And I think there's countless examples where the concept of environmental conservation or environmental protection, right, really can conflict with things that are on the ground for communities and people. I think that's a real challenge for the NGO community writ large to wrap their brains around. And I really think that the environmental NGO community is grappling with some of these issues right now.
I know we've gone a long time. Could I jump in too, though? So I think Erin had said something really important, as well as Seema. Environmental justice lawyering is not just a substantive area of practice. I mean, it's interdisciplinary, so it's inherently not a niche substance, but it is a substantive view. But it's also a lawyering process, which is what Erin had been talking about. And it has very specific values about how you use legal resources and the role of the lawyer in building power for communities. And I think it's also important to just know that although there has always been a very long environmental justice movement that has been led by people of color and Indigenous communities, and also in some cases low-income white communities, that the legal tools and the process of developing environmental justice lawyering happened in response to civil rights laws closing. So people could no longer make progress using anti-racist laws. And so they began to look for other legal hooks to be creative. So a lot of the folks you'll meet in environmental justice lawyering are environmental lawyers, but are civil rights lawyers as well, and are social justice lawyers. And they look at things from that race justice lens in a very different way. I will say within the NGO community, as Seema mentioned, there's a very distinct divide between environmental groups and environmental justice groups. And that divide is important to be aware of as a student, because I'm so sorry, she's like doing this exactly because I'm talking. That divide is important to be aware of as a student. I wasn't aware of it. I interned at an environmental organization after I interned at an environmental justice organization. And if I had done it the other way around, I would not have gotten a call back with the EJ groups that I worked with, because there's a direct history of those groups being at odds in the courts. Like they have literally been on opposite sides in litigation and multiple times. And there's a real feeling of grievance from environmental justice groups that they are often used as a pawn to make environmental advocacy look more attractive. And then when they hold a more protective environmental line policy-wise, that is often disposed of for a more reasonable solution or mediation, and they're not okay with it. And a great example of that in California was our cap and trade program. So we had massive litigation. It was ugly. It's weird for environmental justice and oil to be opposing the rule for completely different reasons. And the way that environmental justice advocates, both grassroots advocates and lawyers, were treated in that process and have been talked about after that process has been ugly and has caused even deeper relationship kind of rending. And now the policy that environmental justice groups wanted the entire time, which was a much more, they wanted cap and tax. They didn't want cap and trade. And that's now what everyone's talking about as the lead policy that we should be moving towards. And it's like, okay, well, you hyper polluted communities for 20 years with a failed program you couldn't track. And now you're coming around and saying it's an okay program. This is all to say, it's good to be aware of that, and it's important to come into those advocacy spaces because there are excellent lawyers who partner with EJ organizations in environmental organizations, but you're going to be working against a bias against the organizational history of those groups. And I have a lot of faith that the new generation of lawyers can help bridge that gap, but it's going to take intentional relationship building and building trust back, because there's been over 40 years of not any trust and a lot of explicit trust breaking happening.
Thanks to all three of you. Those are great answers. And there's a related question about diversity, running environmental organizations. I think you all touched on that actually pretty well in your answer too, that many of the, if we call them the big green groups or conservation groups, certainly 15, 20 years ago, 15 years ago when I started at a big green group, white male domination, almost across the board of running those organizations. You are seeing a shift. It is too slow. It is, I think, kind of painfully slow in most areas. But just to address that question in the chat, I think the comments that you heard from our panelists are spot on, that you're seeing this environmental justice, really kind of demanding the appropriate space within conservation organizations, big green groups, and that is also leading to a diversification of the people that are working at those organizations, which is great to see. Again, moving too slow, but in the right direction. Okay, so I'd like to, in the time we have left, and Seema, I'll start with you on this one. Just curious, we've got law students in the audience, learning from you all as excellent environmental attorneys. Is there something that you didn't know in law school that you wish you knew at this point in your career? Is there maybe a bit of parting advice that you could give our attendees?
So my parting advice is do something in this amazing field. There is so much work to be done in environmental policy and law, or law. You can do one, you can do both, it doesn't really matter, but the environmental field writ large is just amazing. It really is. It's exciting, it's interesting, it's challenging, it's important, it's real. I mean, it's just so many wonderful things, and there are so many people that are doing this work, and we need the help. There's a lot to be done. So that is my parting advice. Join some organization. It doesn't have to be perfect. You will find your way. You will find your way to do amazing things. Be committed to it. This is everyone's fight together, and we need as many people in this field as we can get.
Thank you. Erin, how about you? Any things you wish you knew, or some parting advice?
Yeah, I'll echo that point, that we need you. And it can be scary. It's sort of it feels like a non-traditional career path, and it can be scary when you see your classmates on this very straight and narrow path of on-campus interviews, and some are associate positions at big law firms, and then jumping in there and making a lot of money. But we don't really need more lawyers like that. We need more lawyers that will be creative and add their voices to this very critical field. And in terms of one thing I wish I had known, I'm still a fairly recent graduate, I guess, of law school, just back in 2018. So this is all sort of happening in real time for me, like learning what I wish I had known in law school. But one thing that's become really clear to me is how important it is to have a network of mentors and peers you can call on when you feel like you don't know what you're doing, which is, by the way, a very normal feeling to have when you're first getting started, especially when you're trying to be creative and forge your own path in sort of the environmental law world. But cultivating those relationships while you're in law school, particularly if you're going to be working in a really small nonprofit environment where you don't always have access to the same resources as larger organizations or firms, and you're just often going it alone, trying to learn on the job. Having that network of mentors, former professors, internship supervisors, they can be really critical as you're getting started. So those relationships have been super important to me, and I think that's something to be thinking about while you're still in law school and still applying to jobs.
Excellent. Yeah. And I'll just echo, talk to your professors, get to know them. Yeah, go ahead, Seema. Sorry.
I was just going to add one real quick thing, if it's okay. I just wanted to echo what Aaron said about reaching out. And I just want to just a quick say that anyone listening, if you want to reach out to me, do not be afraid. Reach out, send me an email. I'm happy to talk with you separately about your desired career path. So I just wanted to put that in as an invitation to email. I do need to leave a few minutes early today, so I'm going to sign off, but wanted to just let people know that I'm available to chat, join this field.
Thank you, Seema. And you're also very generous with her time for those of us that practice in this area and need to reach out for advice. So thank you. Camille, how about you? Some advice for our attendees?
My biggest advice is, I think, very similar to Seema's, like, go do the work while you're in law school if you can. I don't think I could have done my Equal Justice Works project had I not spent a ton of time doing work with the communities I wanted to work with. Berkeley did not have an environmental law clinic at the time, and the community development kind of economic justice clinic had shut down when I was there. So I was very upset that I had come to law school for this clinical experience and it was gone. But if you have a clinic, do as much clinic as you can. I think it's super, super helpful. I have gotten more out of clinic than any like substantive environmental law course I took. Don't tell my professors that. I apologize. They were wonderful. But because there were no formal pathways, I just did a ton of like design your own research project or design your own fieldwork kind of things. And almost every law school has it. They can be a little difficult to navigate because they like to have a lot of control usually in the experiential education program about what that relationship is. But I did a ton of just like volunteer work. Sometimes it wasn't even for course credit, just so that I could like physically travel to the communities I wanted to represent. And then I made sure that all my internships were with the communities where I wanted to build relationships. So doing the work is probably the most important way to get into this field, whether you want to go into the more traditional environmental law practice or whether you want to go into environmental justice and community lawyering. All of them value people who back up their interest with their time and who really make a commitment of their time to the kind of practice that they want to go into. And like Nick and Aaron said, your network now is going to continue to grow, but the world is very small. And so like Nick and I will sometimes call each other up or we'll send each other an email if we have a question. And, you know, we've met in person maybe 3 times. So, you know, the world is very small, and the world of environmental and EJ people is small, and water is even smaller. And so, you know, grow that network. You don't put any pressure on yourself about how to network, but just remember that the people you meet now will become people you will run into again.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Aaron, Camille, and Seema. That was awesome. Really, really well done, and appreciate your responsiveness to all the questions and just sharing your really great work. And personally, I want to thank you for that work that you're doing, because it's so critically important, and you're really charging the way forward on so many of these very important issues. So thank you. And I think with that, I will kick it back over to Michaela. It looks like we're having some problems unmuting there, but I would also like to thank all the attendees. Really appreciate it. Appreciate the questions in the chat. Thank you all.
Hi, thank you everyone for attending our session today. I do want to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise. It's always fantastic with this panel. It's always just great getting to hear from others within the public interest legal community and getting the really helpful advice, especially for a lot of our law student attendees who are, starting to figure out, what issue areas they want to get involved in, what they see their careers as after they graduate law school. So I want to thank all of you today. The recording of this session will be available at tomorrow. You'll be able to access it by going back to the session page here. And you'll also have access to Pathful for 1 year after the fair ends. So if you want to continue to listen to this fantastic panel, as I know I'll probably rewatch this recording, you have access to that and can. I also want to thank our event sponsor, Idealist, for supporting this year's 2021 Conference and Career Fair. Thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.